Welcome to our webinar where we will talk about 5 ways to get a better grip on events in your sales data. I'm Deborah Braquet, Sales and Marketing Manager for Solventure LIFe, and later on I will introduce you to our Managing Director, Professor Dr. Bram Desmet, who will also get into the details of getting a better grip on events in your sales data. All right, let's start with the agenda for today. So I will first give an introduction to Solventure LIFe. Who are we? What do we do? And then later on we will get into specific types of events which are affecting your sales data and which you should take into account in order to discover the external demand drivers for your sales. These types of events could be acquisitions or mergers, holidays, promotions, price changes, stockouts, and so on. So then we will show you when you've done that, what you can do after, and how you can use that information to find the leading indicators for your sales. And we will finish with some time to answer your questions. All right. So Solventure LIFe, what do we do? Who are we? At Solventure LIFe, we're specialized in advanced predictive analytics. So over the past 5 years, we've conducted a lot of research in how external information can help us improve the sales and business planning. So what we've seen is that by including external data in the sales forecast and in the business forecast, we've not only improved forecast accuracy, but we've also gained a lot of insights in how the market environment is evolving and what are really the drivers for our sales. What is really driving my sales? Is it the oil price? It could be anything. So what we've done is we've built a tool where we gather data from various external data providers. So this could be, for example, the FRED, the Federal Reserve of Economic Data. They cover more US data. We also have data from the OECD, which is more global, Eurostat, that's of course from Europe, but we also have data from China, and we can also tap into private data providers. So up till now we have more than 2 million global indicators, and what we will do is we look for which of these indicators are important for you and how are you going to take them into account when you do your sales planning. All right, so what we've seen is that by including external information, we've seen that not every industry is affected in the same way by the same external indicators. So for example, events can happen, of course, in each of these industries, but we've seen that promotions play a bigger role in an FMCG environment, whilst macroeconomic indicators have a bigger influence in discrete and chemical types of companies. So all of the industries are affected by external indicators or external effects, but not all in the same with the same significance. So it's a small overview of our references in the different types of industries, and we've seen by doing the leading indicator analysis that it really brings important and useful insights in all of these industries. So it's definitely something to take into account. And then a little word on Solventure. So I've just introduced you Solventure LIFe, specialized in advanced predictive analytics, and we use global leading indicators to improve forecast accuracy and business planning. We also have Solventure S&op. There we are specialized in sales, inventory, and operations planning. We focus there on 4 main pillars. That is people, process, tools, and analytics. And we implement software and deliver software-based services. Then, of course, we also have the Solventure Academy. So we've been around for over a decade in the S&op environment, and we've really built up a big expertise in the supply chain environment. So we also provide trainings on advanced supply chain knowledge. So for example, we have our accelerator days, which happen throughout the year in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Switzerland. and these always cover a specific topic. So it could be inventory, demand, supply, executive S&op. But of course, there's also companies who need really a more tailor-made approach, and maybe your company is struggling with training the people in the demand planning unit on specific demand planning topics. Then of course we can make a more tailor-made and specialized training for your company. So that is basically the two types of engagement you can go into with the Solventure Academy. So 5 ways to get a better grip on events in your sales data. Now, why should you be looking at internal and external events in your sales data? Yeah, it's important to really understand what the sales data has been or what the data has been in the past. This, first of all, to make better future sales forecasts. And also, yeah, it's very important to really understand what is driving your sales. What is the impact of that promotion I've been doing? What is the impact of having a merger? All these types of events you really need to take into account to make a better forecast for the future, and also understand what are the underlying external demand drivers. So what type of effects should you be taking into account when analyzing your data? Could be several. Effects like price changes. What if you change the price of your product? How does the sales change there? These kind of things you need to record and you really need to report on, because it can help you to better make forecasts in the future, and also take that effect off to find the underlying external demand driver. Also, yeah, it could be that you've had a problem with your stock and you didn't have any stock a moment in time. Now, it's really important that you model it as an event, because it can really affect your sales forecast for the next coming months or years. Then this will definitely relate to a lot of people in FMCG. When you do promotions, it's important to keep track of them, and when you've had a promotion, also in order to better model when you have a promotion in the future and see what effects you can expect and what will it do to your sales. Then mergers. For example, recently Clariant and Huntsman have merged. So when the sales forecasts or the sales forecasts are made for a company which had an acquisition or a merger, it's really important to define what's the effect of adding a company or adding some production to our sales data. And then there's also one-off events like Chinese New Year, for example, events which occur every year, like Christmas, which you need to take into account as well. All right, so now I will give the word to our Managing Director, Professor Dr. Bram Desmet, who will dive deeper into these cases.
So as Deborah mentioned, our main goal is really to improve the forecast by using leading indicators. That's where we started. But what we've seen is that to be able to do that, you really need to model a lot of different sources of variability in your demand to be able to detect the true underlying economic factors and economic trends. And I will share a couple of examples of how we as Solventure LIFe have been improving the modeling in our tool. And I have good news and bad news. So let's start with the bad news. The bad news is that we discovered it's much more complex than we had initially anticipated, so it's not easy. Yeah? But the good news is also that there's even a lot more to learn than we had initially anticipated, up to the point, and that's where I hope I will be able to bring you to that point by the end of this webinar, is that in my mind today, I even ask myself the question like, how do companies make a forecast, or how is it possible to make a forecast without modeling external drivers and external events? I'm really up to that point that for me, coming to a good forecast really needs the modeling of external events and indicators. And we will run through a couple of real-life cases that we've worked on over the past year, and use that as a starting point to share our experiences. First case is acquisition of a competitor. So the company where we were running the analysis acquired a competitor. Because of the acquisition, there is a disruptive increase in the sales of over 50% of the sales volume. And if you don't correct for that sales history, and I will show that, it will result in wrong macroeconomic indicators being selected, wrong estimates of seasonality, and simply it will lead to wrong forecast. So let's look at the time series. So here you really see that this was the sales to the left before the acquisition. This is the sales after the acquisition. And the question is, how do we deal with this in forecasting? Well, one idea could be like, okay, well, if this is the sales history of the old company, maybe we should also add the sales history of the new company, so that we kind of get the total sales of the two companies even before the actual merger or takeover. But you run into a lot of practical problems. Integrating the data of two ERP systems or BI systems, you think it's easy, but it's often not. So also in this case, it was very hard to get a clear picture on that. The only thing we were really could get our hands on was this type of data where we say, this is the data really before the acquisition, this is the data after the acquisition. If you don't model that acquisition in a special way and you run it through a traditional statistical forecast, this is what you get on the next slide. And so on the top here is our sales data. So you see the data before, then you see the acquisition, and you see the sales data after. And if you run that to a normal statistical technique, you will try to look for seasonality. That is what is shown over here. You will try to look for trend. And what you cannot explain as seasonality or trend typically ends up in the noise, or it is called here the remainder. And so if we don't model the step change here as an acquisition, what you will see is that from a trend perspective, we see that there is an increase in trend here. We see that there is an increase in the trend, and that trend then kind of flattens out a little bit. That trend is, of course, it's overestimating the actual increase in this period, and it's underestimating the actual increase really after the acquisition. That's also what you see here in the errors. So you see that the error is negative here, meaning that we have overestimated the acquisition, and here it's that the error is positive, which means that we have really underestimated. So a traditional technique really has a difficulty to model this type of step change. So we need to do something different. Moreover, if you know that there is a relatively big error in this area around the acquisition, well, be aware that also in this area you will be estimating seasonality, because if you look, you see there is kind of a double peak pattern. There's peak 1, peak 2, peak 1, peak 2. Also over here, peak 1, peak 2. You also have a peak 1 here, and you have a peak 2 here close to the acquisition. If you mess up the estimate of the trend, you will also mess up the estimate of your seasonality. So it is also all linked together. So you really need to be careful when you have significant events with the normal statistical techniques, so to speak. So what can we do? Well, if you know a little bit of basic statistics, you can model this as an event and just say, well, before, I typically say 0, there is no acquisition. After, this is 1, there is an acquisition. And I can try to model like, okay, what is the lift I get from that acquisition? That's what we have done here. If I would do that, well, what you would be able to do is I can correct the sales history for the effect of the acquisition. So you would see here that this was the sales history before. This is now the sales history after, and after correcting for the acquisition. So modeling it really helps to better understand what is the impact, for instance, of an acquisition. The alternative for this is really doing it on a customer SKU level, right? Because You might both have been delivering to the same customers. You might have had different products. So if you really want to sort it out, you need to do it at a customer SKU level, which can be quite tedious. It can be quite troublesome. This one is going really fast. But the approach here is too simple, and I will try to explain in the next slide. What you see here is again the decomposition. So I'll show this slide once more. What you see here is that this is before, this is after, and if you look here, what you would see is like here the sales seems to be increasing a little bit. It seems to be decreasing, running up or into the acquisition, and after the acquisition it seems that there is a slightly increasing trend. That's what you could see over here. If we look at the deseasonalized or at the pattern where the event has been taken into account, so this is the data where we have taken off the acquisition. This is the estimate of the seasonality. This is the estimate of the trend. And you see that there seems to be a kind of an overreaction. Yes, I do believe that there seems to be a kind of an increase and a decrease over here. But this is really going all the way up and all the way down. So when we looked into more detail in the modeling, our feeling was that something wasn't let's say yet there or yet perfect. So how do you define this type of event modeling? It is important, as I already mentioned, if you're trying to estimate the effect of an acquisition or any type of event, remember that you're always estimating at the same time seasonality. You might at the same time be estimating trend. So if we define the estimate of our event, of our acquisition, by at the same time, that's what we've done here, adding trend and seasonality, it helps us to improve the estimate of the acquisition. So instead of estimating just one effect, we are estimating 3 effects at the same time: the trend, the seasonality, and the acquisition. And that gave a better, a more correct estimate of what is really the effect of the acquisition. And you see that while the sales was kind of declining and dropping back, now I rather see, well, the increase, decrease here, and then I see that slightly increasing trend I also observe here in my total sales. And this is again now on the second model, where we have an improved estimate of the acquisition. What you see here is that I do have an increase, which is then a little decrease, and that's again the same over here. It seems to be increasing, decreasing before we run into the acquisition, and after the acquisition, that's what you also see over here. You seem to have a kind of an increasing trend. Well, that increasing trend, that is also what we see over here. If you compare the two, you see that the effect of the increase and decrease seems to be more exaggerated to the left. To the right, it's a bit more mild, and it seems to be better reflecting what is really going on in the sales series. Why is it important? Well, remember that what we are really after, or what we are really up to, is model these increases and decreases in trend using macroeconomic indicators. So if you're delivering to the automotive, what type of automotive indicators would help me to explain the increase and the decrease in the trend of my sales? The same if you would be delivering into construction business, what type of indicators help me to explain what are really the trend changes in my sales? Depending on how you treat the events, and this was the first example, the acquisition, you see that the trend looks quite different. So to be able to identify the right indicators, we need to be able to remove events in the correct way. If I remove it in the left method, I will find a different set of indicators, right? Because I would be modeling this type of more exaggerated ups and downs. If I model the event on the right way, I see that the ups and downs are a bit more mild, so clearly I will end up with different indicators. And so that's why I said in the beginning it's more complex. Why? Because we have really, through the different exercises we have done, we have really understood that modeling events is essential in being able to reveal the underlying macroeconomic trends. And so from that perspective, our event modeling capability has significantly improved through the different exercises we have done. That has also been incorporated in the software, so it's available basically for you. And it's also a factor which you should not underestimate if you would try to do this type of exercises on your own. Okay, so that was the first one. Changing the method, you can see it. The effect of the acquisition changed from 93% to 30%. So initially we kind of overestimated the effect of the acquisition. By the more refined modeling, we were more in line with reality, and that helped us to better match, let us say, the real causal macroeconomic indicators. That's what we have been doing in this first case. Second case, let's call it variable date event. So we will look at modeling Chinese New Year, and we will look at modeling a stock out. So this is data from an FMCG company. If you run a traditional statistical modeling, the red curve is what is the forecast. The black curve is the real sales data. And step by step we will try to bring the red curve closer to the black curve, so the red curve being the forecast and the black curve being the sales. In the first step, you see that if you run a traditional statistical method, we don't identify something like Chinese New Year. Why is that? Well, Chinese New Year is every year in a different period, in a different week, at a different date. It's comparable to Easter. It can be comparable to the Ramadan. So some calendar seasonality always occurs at the same date, like New Year's Eve is always the 31st of December, so that's a fixed date. And traditional techniques are able to detect seasonality which always occurs at the same date. If the seasonality is not occurring exactly at the same date, like Chinese New Year or the other examples I've given, traditional statistical techniques will fail. So it's quite easy to identify this as an external event. You basically would do it in a comparable way as you would indicate that acquisition that we have introduced in the previous case. If we do that, this is the result as we have shown in the next slide. So you see that we now better match all of the peaks. So this was the original slide. If I jump to the next one, you will see that the peaks of Chinese New Year, that they are more correctly modeled. The forecast model is not yet perfect, so we still have to further improve it. And next thing we want to take a look at is, we clearly see there has been a stock out here. For a couple of weeks we have been out of stock, and that influences our forecasting model. Why is that? Well, actually I can see here, these are the comparable periods in the blue circles, the comparable periods in the previous years. I can see that my forecast is too low. The red line is lower than the black line. Also in this year, 2015, the red line is lower than the black line. Why is that? Well, my forecast is now taking into account the zero sales here. But of course, I don't want to predict the zero sales. This should be considered as a kind of an exception. How can I do that? Well, if I do it in a traditional method, what some companies would do is they would try to interpolate the missing sales here and say, okay, if I would have had stock, what would the sales have been like? So some companies would just try to fill in something for the black line and say, well, maybe I will just copy the sales of the last year in 2016 as to kind of make my original data better. And another thing I see companies doing is that they try to cut out simply a part of the history. But one of the challenges is, if I just cut out this period, how to make sure that for parts of 2016 I do incorporate the 2016 data, and for other parts of 2016 I'm not incorporating the 2016 data. So in a lot of cases analysis, if you would have a statistical forecasting software, this is quite cumbersome to do. You need to play around with your original sales data and clean it or correct it, or you need to even modify your forecasting methods so that for parts of the history they do look at 2016 and for parts of the history they do not look at 2016. Yeah? This is all not that easy. If you model it with external data, it's again much more easy because you will simply indicate that, well, something happened in this period. If I look at the sales data, I know that something happened in this period. If everything is 0 over here, I know that I had an out of stock or that I had a serious quality issue, which called me to withdraw all of the stock from the market, and which meant that in that period I did not have sales. So I will just tell the model that something happened, being that I went out of stock. If I do that, so if I treat it as an external event, what you will see in the next slide is that, well, of course my forecast here will drop to 0, and you also see that if I correct for that, that my forecast is being increased. So if I step one back, here the red line was below the black line, so my forecast was underestimating the sales, and that was primarily because I was taking into account the 0 sales in 2016. If I model it as an event, I can see that my forecast is now more in line with my actual sales. Our forecast is still not perfect. Later on in this webinar, we will try to further improve our forecast by also taking a look at price, but that's really the last case I want to take a look at. So again, compared to what we started with, the modeling of the acquisition, adding external events to your data and really telling to the forecasting model, like, what are sales drivers? What is really influencing my sales? It's relatively easy because you know what happened here. You just need to indicate it to the forecast model. It can be more complex, as we have seen with the acquisition, because depending on how you statistically model it, you can get different results. And if your end goal is also to do macroeconomic leading indicator forecasting, it needs to be quite precise. So it's not that straightforward, but you learn a lot from it. You really see here that, okay, if I take this out, my sales in 2014, 2015 in that period was quite predictable. And also towards the future, I'm more confident that my forecast will be okay. Let's look at the third case, promotions. We will look at an FMCG company. Well, we know that in FMCG, promotions are very important. Weather effects, calendar effects are quite important. We will not talk about weather effects here. We will talk about weather effects in our next webinar, but I will talk about promotions and I will talk about calendar effects. And what I typically like to do is, well, this is sales history. It's 2 years of sales history. It's in weekly periods, and it's from an FMCG company. And so the black line is really the historical sales, and you see there is quite a high variability. You see that I have peaks, and that peaks are easily like double to even 3 times my average sales. So I know that calendar effects, I know that promotions are quite important if I'm in FMCG. If I would only take into account a trend, I see that, well, there is a declining trend here in this example. Yeah? What happens if I add the month of the year, so monthly calendar seasonality? I know that this is probably December, the last month of the year, my sales will be high. Why? People like Christmas, they like New Year's Eve, they will shop a bit more, they will buy more of my stuff to share it with some of the friends and the family. So some months in the year will be better, some months in the year will be worse, right? So this is monthly seasonality. If I add the monthly seasonality, this is what I can explain. So you see that part of the big peaks over here, part of the peaks seem to be occurring each year due to a specific month, right? So part of that peaks seems to be monthly seasonality, yeah, but the forecast is far from okay, far from perfect. So let's add something next. Let's add the week of the month. what does that mean? Well, in general, we see that in retail, the first week of the month is better compared to the last week of the month. That has to do with the purchasing power of the average income. The purchasing power is higher in the beginning of the month when people just got their wages compared to the end of the month, when they are really looking into the next month to get their new wage to be able to go shopping again. If I compare the two, where this is still a bit more a flat line, if I add the week of the month, I see that some of the peaks are kind of inflated. They are a bit reinforced. I don't explain the full peak, but at least if I look at this peak over here, I see that my forecast model is already closer to the actual sales. So most probably for this specific peak, a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's the first week of a specific month. I can see that I'm already quite close here. What else can we add? We can add public holidays. We've been talking about Chinese New Year. You could add Easter. We could add Christmas. You could add any type of holiday events which you know can influence your sale. If you're in FMCG, that's quite likely. If you're in retail, it's certainly likely. What do I see? That some of the peaks here, this is Christmas. Some of the peaks are really due to the fact that it's Christmas. These are the Christmas peaks, these two, but I can also see that some of the other peaks are not yet explained or not yet modeled. How can that be done? Well, in the next step, let's add promotions. If I add promotions, I'll scroll a bit between the two. If I add promotions, I really see that I'm explaining more of the individual peaks. So for instance, this peak, clearly this is due to a promotion. This peak, clearly this is due to a promotion. So I see that the peaks are more and more matched. But I'm still not yet there, right? Because I'm still a bit off on some of the peaks. And on the other hand, I'm not correctly estimating some of the downward peaks like this one. I see this is my forecast. This is the actual sales. My forecast is basically too high. What else can I add as effects? Well, what I know is that if I run a promotion for 2 or 3 weeks, I expect that the promotion will have a different impact in week 1, week 2, and week 3. So that's what we call here the week number of the promo. Maybe the uplift is higher in the first week compared to the second and the third week. I can also add cannibalization, because if my promos have been announced, then most probably just before the promo week, I will see a downward peak, because some customers are waiting to buy until the promo is there. And also after the promotion, I will get a downward peak, because people have simply been buying more during the promo period. So after the promo, they will buy less. So I'm cannibalizing my own sales. I could also in the same way model cannibalization across products. That's all possible. So if I compare the two forecasts, what you can easily see, like if I look at this peak over here, if I know that this is the first week, the effect in the first week will be stronger compared to the second or the third week. So also the second peak over here, if I look at this peak, I can see that this peak is much better modeled if I account for the week of the promo. Another thing which I can see, if I look at the peak here before my promo, if I add the cannibalization before, I see that I slightly corrected downwards. So all of this really helps to step-by-step improve the modeling of your demand. And this is another example which for me means, like, if I look at this specific example, most probably I have kind of a long-term declining trend. And a lot of the variability for this specific item is due to calendar effects. So the month of the year, the week in the month, whether I have promos, yes or no. So a lot of the variability has been explained by that. If you would be looking for this type of product in the UK, one of the questions is really like, what does the Brexit have an influence on my sales in the UK? Well, if you want to know what is the effect of the Brexit on your sales in the UK, you really need to be able to remove the effects of the calendar, of the promos, to be able to reveal what is the underlying impact of the Brexit, right? So always keep that in mind, that the reason why we model these events is to be able to reveal what is the underlying macroeconomic trend and what is affecting your sales, let us say, more from a macroeconomic perspective. Last case has to do with pricing. Okay, this is an example where on the one hand we have price, on the other hand we have quantity sold, and we see this is a company where the price is quite variable. We see that the price sometimes goes up, even up to 4, let's say from 1 to 4, it goes down, and we also see that there is clearly a relationship between the price and the quantity sold. In general, I can see that if my price is lower, I will be selling more. Yeah? And if I increase my price, I'm typically selling less. Yeah? So what can we do with that type of relationship? We can try to model it. Yeah? We can try to plot some or fit some kind of curve, which is example by example shown here. If I know that, I could use this type of analysis to do pricing analysis and pricing optimization, because if I have the curve, I could easily ask, like, okay, what's best? What would be the quantity sold if I sell at 175? What's the quantity sold if I sell it at 2 euros? Well, if I have modeled my curve, I can easily say, well, if this is the model that we use, well, selling at a price of 2 is like selling 1.5. If I sell at 1.75, I will sell like 3.5 units, right? So if I look at the revenue, well, the revenue here will be like 6.125, whereas if I sell at 2 euros, yeah, the sales would be like around 3 euros or $3. So clearly, it's much more beneficial to sell at 1.75 compared to selling at 2. So if you have this type of data, first of all, you can use this type of relationship to optimize your pricing decision. That's the first thing which you can do. What we want to use it for here is we want to use it to improve the forecast, because this is the same example we have shown before. Remember that we were trying to model downward peaks where we were modeling the Chinese New Year. Yeah? And also remember that the forecast was not yet perfect. Well, if we look over here, well, we can see that here the dark black line are the actual sales. The blue line is really the forecast. Here we are kind of underestimating the actual sales. If we look at the second window here, these are the actual sales, the black line. The blue line is the forecast, which is high. So here we seem to be overestimating the actual sales. What we can also easily do is we can incorporate the price into the forecasting model. Right? This is what we have done here. So let's again scroll between the two screens. Yeah? This is without pricing information. This is including the pricing information. So I see that if I include the price where I was still underestimating, my forecast is more in line here. And where over here, where I was overestimating, I see my forecast is more in line here. So if you are a company which has regular price changes, yeah, and price changes could be because you have some kind of promotion policy, or price changes could be because you have contracts with your customers where your sales price is linked to that of certain key raw materials. In any case, if you have frequent changes in your price and you know that the price has an impact on the volume you sell, yeah, then you need to take that into account into your forecasting model, right? Imagine that if you are this company, imagine how you would make a forecast without accounting for the price. Yeah? And the forecasting goes in 2 steps, right? First of all, historically, we try to come to understand an understanding of what is really driving the sales. And we have just seen that the price is one of the key drivers of your sales. If we make a forecast looking forward, of course, yeah, we can do it on one price, or we can do it on a projected price. You can also, looking forward, easily run scenarios. So you could, based on this model, easily see like, what would my forecast look like, my volume forecast, or what would be my volume forecast, or what would be my euro forecast looking forward, based on a certain price level. And I can also run scenarios. So what if I would have a lower pricing? What instead of 1.75 I would go to 1.5? Or what if I would go to a more exclusive pricing? If instead of 1.75 I would go to 2 or 2.5? What would be the impact on the quantity sold, as we show it here, and what would be the impact on my sales revenue in dollars or in euros? That's really the type of analysis which comes from this type of models. And again, what we've taken into account here is calendar seasonality, price information. Yeah, but if you know that you are depending on certain sectors, whether it's construction or whether it's automotive or any type of sector you can think of, yeah? Or if you know that a certain event can have a major impact like the Brexit, or like a certain change in the import tariffs, and you want to understand what is really the impact or the potential impact on your sales, you will first need to control these type of variabilities before you can really understand the underlying effect. And that's where I started. On the one hand, yeah, it turned out for us to be more complex than we had maybe initially hoped for, but at the same time, the amount of information you get on what is really driving your sales is so overwhelming that I have come to a point where I ask myself, like, you know, how can companies even make a forecast without really modeling the demand drivers? And I'm also personally a strong believer that forecasting will go this direction. It will not be about who has the best forecasting technique. It's more about who has the best information and who is able to use that information in the best possible way to correctly model the demand. That's also what we are after with Solventure LIFe. So let me try to summarize. What do we have? We have events in our sales, acquisitions, price changes, import tariffs. Recently we had a case where we say, well, there is a competitor which is going bankrupt. So we see that customers are coming from that competitor towards us. Yeah? So we see an increase in our market share. This is really a difficult one to model, but it has a crucial impact on your sales. So you need to know what is happening to be able to make a good forecast, and also looking backward, if you had this type of events, you need to correctly model it to be able to correctly assess what was the impact of that defaulting competitor compared to price changes you had, compared to any acquisitions you did. So you need to model these events. Stockouts, Chinese New Year's, these are a couple of examples we have shown. We talked about promotions, the effect during, but also before and after, cannibalization across products. Your company might even have information about promos of competitors. Yeah? A promo of a competitor might be cannibalizing your sales. If you have that type of information, it can easily be included. And we also looked at pricing, how pricing can have an effect on your sales volume and on your sales revenue. And all this information is required, on the one hand, to correctly estimate kind of a sales baseline. We need to have a correct estimate of that sales baseline to be able to detect the macroeconomic dependencies. Then looking forward, we make the macroeconomic forecast of the baseline sales, and we can add the events and promotions and pricing information then back to it to really come to a significantly improved forecast, and in any case, a forecast where you have a much better understanding of what really is driving the future sales compared to not using this type of models. And the next webinar, we will kind of continue on this type of theme. We will discuss the impact of weather. What's the impact of weather on sales? And we typically see two effects. That's just to trigger your interest. So an example could be if you're selling swimming pools. Well, if I'm selling swimming pools, I expect two effects. First of all, I expect an effect in timing. If I have an early summer or I have a late summer peak, that really defines the timing of when my first sales are starting to happen, right? A second effect will simply be the volume. It also has a volume effect, whether like if it's a very good summer, I will sell a lot more swimming pools, maybe compared to last year. If it's a very bad summer, I will sell significantly less swimming pools compared to last year. So weather has an impact at least in these two ways, and we will explain more on how to take into account weather effects into your let's say demand modeling, into your forecasting in the next webinar, which is planned I think for the first week of June, but I'll have or July rather, I have Deborah confirm that. So Deborah, I'll hand back over to you here.
Thanks, Bram, for your extended explanation. How we then typically, after we have been modeling the different events, of course need to look for indicators that are affecting the sales. So if you look at this approach, so how we typically approach the leading indicator forecasting is we first look at what kind of external demand drivers are important for you. So we start with a mind map. What are important things which you should take into account? What are important things connected to your product group, your sales environment? And then we will do a pre-processing. So we will take that information into account when we are looking for external demand drivers in our data tool. And then we will let our brute force statistics find relevant indicators for you. When we have selected those indicators which have come out of that indicator scan or analysis, we will validate the indicators there. So we will look at how these indicators behave over a period of time, like 3 to 6 months, and then in order to ultimately define which ones you're going to use and implement in your sales forecasting system. So that is typically how we approach these types of analysis and how we find those leading indicators relevant for your business. So first of all, it's very important to indicate a specific sales series to really understand that data. So the taking of the events, like we explained today, what is the impact of these specific cases or specific events happening your sales. And then when you have understand that and when you have really defined which events are impacting your sales, you can start look for external demand drivers which will help you make a better forecast and make a more precise estimate of where your sales is going. And when you have found those external indicators, afterwards you can put back on the event. So if you will have a promotion next month, you can model it and put those event and trend back on to have a perfect forecast. All right, thank you all for joining the webinar. Thank you, Bram, as well, for joining, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.